Hello and welcome to Mechanicsburg Mystery Presents, a conversation with Ellen Crosby. Ellen Crosby has had a lively and varied career as an international journalist. She has worked as a freelance reporter in the United States and as well as London, Moscow, and Geneva. She was Moscow correspondent for ABC Radio News. She was a regional stringer and feature writer for the Washington Post and has written feature stories for major newspapers nationwide. She has written several novels based on her experiences, such as Moscow Nights, and 2 mysteries featuring international photojournalist Sophie Medina. We're here today to talk about her Virginia Wine Country mystery series, the 11th of which, The French Paradox, was recently published. Ellen's books are popular at the Mechanicsburg Mystery Bookshop, and we're thrilled to have her here today. Ellen, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Bill. It's great. It's nice to see you again, although I wish it were in person as we had done the last time.
Oh, absolutely. It was like 3 years ago, I think in 2018, we did an event at the store.
Was it only 3 years ago? Wow.
Yeah, and then the year after that, there was a blizzard, so you weren't able to return.
Right.
And then, of course, what happened next.
Yeah. Right.
What I like about your series in particular is the shifting variety of locations, characters. You seem to write according to what you want to talk about at the time or what the story takes you to. So that's why you do something like the Vineyard Victims, where you have a presidential candidate, a former candidate, dead in front of Lucy's vineyards, or the Vineyard Vendetta that takes place in Washington, D.C.
Right.
Your characters also seem to come and go as well. And with this book, you have the return of Lucy's siblings, right?
Right. What, her sister.
Yeah.
She comes back. Yes.
Yeah. Also that's right, Mia, the artist, who has brought along her latest boyfriend.
Yes. Boyfriend du jour. Yes.
Boyfriend du jour. And it all takes place. I was plotting out your book last night because I read through it and enjoyed it very much. And I saw that as I laid it out chart-wise, there's paintings from 16th century painter, 17th century, I get those confused.
1800, yeah.
1800 women painter. You have Parker Lord, who's written a book about climate change and the troubles he had with a researcher. You have Jackie Onassis as well, and her time in Paris with Lucy's grandfather, Pepe. This must have been a really easy book to write.
Oh, just, so easy. It was so hard. It was, I find 2 disparate things, and then with every book, I don't know why I do it, but it's just gotten to be my thing. And I find these 2 plots, and usually one is an old one and one is a contemporary one, because I love history. And so the Jackie plot in this one is history. And then I need to find a way that's sort of organic, that they will come together. And my husband has heard me moan about this with every book. It's like, how am I going to do this? What am I going to do? So I knew I wanted to write a book about Jackie Kennedy because she spent a lot of time in Middleburg. In fact, there's a little pavilion named for her in Middleburg, right near the visitor center. She went there to hunt and ride. She actually fell off her horse when she was fox hunting. And when she was in the hospital, that's how they diagnosed, or they made an early diagnosis of her lymphoma, that she died from 6 months later. So I knew, Jackie was very much a part of Middleburg when, starting back with her husband's presidency, all the way up to, right before her death. So for years, 30 some years. And I wanted to write about her. And then I have a friend who's an artist, and she is on the board of the National Museum of Women in the Arts. And she had said to me a while back, she said, have you ever thought about writing about some of the women artists who never have been, they're called the old mistresses. They were as important and as talented as the old masters, but they never had any paintings in any of the major galleries until finally this art gallery was founded in Washington. She said, I think it's a really kind of cool topic. And I love art. So I thought, that'd be really interesting to write about. So I thought, well, how am I going to write about the National Museum of Women in the Arts and these female artists and Jackie Kennedy? And how can I marry them? And much to my something always falls in my lap. And in this case, it was an article in the New York Times travel section written by a friend of mine named Anne Ma. And she happened to write about Jackie Kennedy's junior year in Paris, where she studied art history. And so I thought, what if Jackie found one of these paintings by these old mistresses when she was there 70 years ago, when they were still, you could pick them up for, a couple of bucks or something like that. They weren't that popular. Now they're worth, they belong in museums. So Anne's New York Times article gave me kind of the way to sort of marry the two subjects for my book. But it took a long time to figure that how I was going to do that.
Yeah. Well, and since you have a standard kind of cast of characters, it also becomes a matter of deciding which characters are going to play a role and how big of a role they're going to play in this particular story. Since, like I say, you brought back her sister, Lucy's sister,
who's an artist, I was like, she can come back and be part of the story. So, yeah,
and it was interesting hearing you talk about Jackie Onassis, just because one of my favorite spots is Charlottesville, Virginia.
Oh, I love Charlottesville.
And we've visited there, my wife and I, and the presence of Thomas Jefferson there seems so strong. We joke about it that the residents talk about him as if he's just gone out to the store for a pack of smokes and a lottery ticket.
Yeah. It's a beautiful town. I mean, the University of Virginia is there, which he founded, as you know. So yeah, Jefferson's always sort of a kind of a background presence, I think, in my books because of his interest in gardening and especially because of his interest in wine. I mean, he's the reason he wanted America to have a wine industry. I mean, that was a really, really big deal for him.
Mm-hmm.
As you probably know.
You had talked about that. Apparently, he was never able to get vineyards established, even though he tried, and he even had connections in France when he was over there as ambassador to be able to bring back information and plants and cuttings.
Right. He grew 28 different kinds of grapes and never got a single bottle of wine. He was really, really frustrated. They called him America's first wine geek. And so when he went to France, he did this whole big tour of all the storied vineyards of France and learned whatever he could. What he didn't understand was that the French grapevines would never grow in America with all the pests and everything we have. Mm-hmm. And in fact, years later, when there was this disease, this louse, actually phylloxera, that went over that migrated to France when American vineyards were imported, the way they saved the French vineyards was they brought American rootstock over and they grafted the base of the hardy American rootstock to the French vines, and that's how they saved the French vines by the same rootstock that had actually decimated the French vineyards. That was what saved it. So yeah, it's been really it's an interesting story.
Yeah, it was interesting to bring that into the French paradox because Lucy has trouble with her Merlot vines and calls in an expert, and the little bit of discussion about why she was having the problems. Again, that's that little bit of knowledge that I really find fascinating, even though I don't grow wine myself. I just would rather enjoy it, the old-fashioned way.
Yes.
This is throat coat, by the way. It's not wine, but I figured in your honor, I'd put it in a wine glass.
Thank you. Cheers.
So, why did you call it French paradox?
Well, do you know what the French paradox is?
Well, actually, I do, but
okay. Well, then I'll tell. But we'll tell everybody else who doesn't.
You told me in previous interviews I've listened to. So.
Okay. All right. Well, I read. So back in the 1980s, there was I guess it was a study where a group of nutritionists or scientists or whatever couldn't figure out why a country like France where people had a diet that was high in saturated fat, they ate all that cheese, all that pâté, all that rich food that they had with the cream sauces and everything else. Why in France they had such a low incidence of heart disease? And they finally worked their way back to the fact that, well, the French drink a lot of wine, and particularly red wine, and there's something in red wine called resveratrol. And they believe that sort of helps your heart. So 60 Minutes in America ran a story on this in the 80s. And it was all of a sudden, wine is like a health food, and grapes are fruit, And so, right. I mean, America just went crazy because the wine industry really did go, take off with this and run with it, that wine's healthy for you. You should drink it. It helps your heart. Look at the French. They drink wine. We should drink wine. And it was incredible. What it did. And it was called the French paradox because why would, with this diet they eat, that the French have, is a real paradox that they are able to, that they have this longevity, that they don't have the incidence of coronary heart disease that we do in America, for example.
Yeah.
So, and it was there was kind of the whole double, with, meaning in it with Jackie buying the paintings in France, and and then her grandfather, Lucy's grandfather, coming over from France. So there's a lot of French elements in the book.
Yeah. And also you have grandfather Pepe coming over from France as well to celebrate the 90th birthday party of this woman, Cricket. What was her last name?
Delacroix.
Better you say it than I do. I would just murder it. So you have that, and then there's intimations of a close relationship between Jackie and Pepe, and how there's also elements of privacy involved in this as well, because Jackie's journal shows up, and there's apparently letters in existence. And I don't want to give away too much of the plot. Better to read it yourself. But it kind of comes down to the question of history. What does history deserve to know? What do we deserve to know about a person?
It's really interesting because I wrote an article for Criminal Element, the Macmillan blog, and then I did an interview with the woman who is the director of a historical library in Leesburg, and she said to me, and this is a little bit of a spoiler, but she said the letters from Jackie Kennedy that show up in the book, she said, as an archivist, those letters should be preserved, and people should be able to see them. And I'm not going to give away anything that happened in the plot, but she said, as an archivist, we want that information. But the thing that I ended up writing about for Criminal Element was what right we have to privacy, and sort of the whole notion of celebrity privacy today, and what Jackie was like. And there was an article in the Washington Post that I had kept years ago that talked about actually John Kennedy and Carolyn Bessette. And it was the 20th anniversary of when his plane crashed off the coast of Nantucket. And it talked about the two of them, as part of the last generation of people who believed that a private life was meant to be private, that it wasn't something to be for sale, that it wasn't something that you would, that now people, they'll sell everything. I mean, the people will publish their tell-all, their sex life. I mean, everything's so personal, and it's all packaged and marketed, and you see it on Instagram, and it's their perfect life, and what they do, and it's all branded and stylized and for sale. And Jackie, instilled in her son, and I think also in Caroline, this notion that a private life is something that when you lose it, you just don't get it back, and it's to be protected, and it's fragile, and you cherish it. And I worked as a journalist way back when and in those days, if you wrote about somebody, if you mentioned anybody in a newspaper article, and I wrote a lot of regional feature stories for the Post, so there are people who get their name right, and that story is going to be tacked up on their refrigerator, spell their name wrong, and they're going to want everybody to have a copy of it, spell their name wrong, and it's going to go in the trash, and they're not going to talk about it. But you had to be very careful what you revealed about somebody, and make sure that you weren't betraying anything, that you weren't saying something that was private. And now it's just, everybody wants to tell you everything. Yeah. So I had really strong feelings about the whole privacy notion and what people are entitled to. And I wrote a previous book about DNA and whether or not, you have the right to go back and find your, if you're an adopted child, whether or not your parents, your birth parents had the right to privacy. So I think it's a really complicated subject.
Yeah. And there's lots of room for nuance. And it also it's interesting to find out for there are authors who were very reluctant to share anything. I mean, you see that Charles Dickens, for example, had bonfires in which he burned his letters, and he burned any papers that would describe anything. And at the same time, you have Philip Roth, who opened the door to hire an official biographer, and that seemed to go south soon after publication because of the biographer's own troubles that were being talked about. So
I know. I have a deal with one of my girlfriends. In fact, my artist friend, that they've got a backyard. Her husband has like a big fire pit. We're both going to throw our journals in it. And Alexander from the Library of Congress is like, you can't do that. And I thought, why do people keep journals? I mean, I don't ever go back and I don't actually go back and read my journals, but I keep them to have sort of a document of my life, to kind of record things, because I'm a writer, and that it's more real to me when I write it down. It also seems that that even the most sort of mundane or ordinary day, there's something to write about and to keep me sort of focused on those details and kind of aware of all of that. But, what do I mean, I don't know. I just never expected anybody to read about it later, I think.
Or be that interested in it.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I've read Samuel Pepys's diaries that are annotated, and they're just amazing at finding out how somebody lives from day to day.
I know.
And yet
I love journals too. I have to say, Anne Rand's journal, and what was her name? It'll come to me. But anyway, but I love reading journals too.
Yeah, I collect those as well because they seem to be the most honest expression of that person, at least the ones who never expected their journals to be made public.
Right.
You look at Anais Nin and you know there is going to be somebody, what's true and what's not. Because she's revised and rewritten her journals, and there's even one story, in fact, I think she actually cobbled together, I think her husband caught her in an affair or suspected her of it.
When did he not?
Yes, and she faked a journal to show, see, on this day I wasn't there.
Yeah. She was those were quite scandalous. I read those years ago.
Yeah, they're wonderful.
Yeah.
But anyway, let's move on to our painter, Élisabeth. How do you pronounce her last name?
Vigée-Le Brun.
Le Brun. Élisabeth Le Brun. What is it about her paintings that catch your eye? I've seen some of them, and they're good portraits. I think the one of Lady Emma Hamilton was the one in particular that really said, "Wow, that's worth looking at." I mean, what is it that speaks to you?
Well, first of all, the way actually I got the gift of, this is a person you might want to look at, an artist, and my friend put me in touch with the librarian at the National Museum of Women in the Arts, and who suggested Vigée-Le Brun to me, and then I discovered that she'd been Marie Antoinette's portraitist, and that I wanted that French connection, so that worked out. Plus, Jackie Kennedy had edited a book of letters between Marie Antoinette and her mother, Maria Theresa. So I had that whole connection going on. But the artist herself, one of the docents told me when I was at the museum that one of the reasons that she was so popular and so well, she was very young. Her husband was the first curator at the Louvre. She was the one who made all the money in the family. He was the one who spent all the money in the family. She did have to flee France because she was so tied with Marie Antoinette. And when Marie Antoinette was carted off to the guillotine, Vigée-Le Brun left, and she ended up sort of bouncing around, I guess, for lack of a better word, all the European courts where she was very, very popular. Everybody loved her except Catherine the Great of Russia. There's always one. So she didn't get along with Catherine the Great. But what people loved about her was the royals who she painted, was she humanized everybody. She made them look, Marie Antoinette looks, I mean, she doesn't look like this queen that, the very sort of distant and sterile and everything else, but she looks like a mother, and she looks like a, she just humanized everybody and softened them and made them not, I don't know, kinder is probably the wrong word, but just less stiff, less formal, and flattered them, and sort of managed to find the thing that they'd look at the painting and love it, and so they saw something in themselves in her painting. So that's what made her so sought after.
There was one that I saw today as I was looking her up, and it's her with her children. And one of them is her son pointing to an empty crib, and it's a reference to a child that died soon after being born.
Right.
It's kind of a memory to that particular daughter. Yeah. Well, the research must have been with those resources. The research behind it at the museums must have been, just a doddle.
Yeah. Well, the ironic part of it is that so we finally went to the museum. My friend said, "Well, you have to go. I mean, we're going to have to go and see everything." And she's busy painting, and I'm writing, and all the stuff's going on. So we decided. She said we went in February of 2020. And we got there, and since she's on the board, she introduced me to the director and the deputy director, and I sat down with the deputy director, and we had coffee, and the three of us had coffee in the museum. It's a beautiful building. If you get to Washington, it's an old Masonic building, and it's gorgeous. It looks like a palace. It's exquisite. And so we had coffee, and we were talking, and I said, I want Jackie Kennedy's paintings that she found in this bookstall in Paris that she bequeathed to her friend, to Cricket Delacroix, and they're going to be bequeathed to the museum. So I said, how would that happen? And who would do that? Would that be you? And she said, no, actually, that would be our chief curator. And she started telling me about this woman. And she said, she's full of stories. She's really great. You should talk to her. She's not here today. Why don't you come back? So I said, that'd be great. So, we go back to Virginia. We take an Uber back to Virginia, the two of us, and we agree that, in a couple of weeks, we'll go back again and speak to the curator. Then March 2020 came, and the museum closed, and everything closed, and it was over. And the door slammed shut so fast. In fact, we'd been talking about it, and the deputy director was saying, I don't know, I travel so much with the museum. I don't know, am I going to be able to go anywhere? And I don't know what to do. And they had a trip for some of the people on their board. They were going to go to Mexico, I think. No, Morocco. And who even thought? So I wrote the deputy director, Eileen Gutman, and I said, well, do you think I could just have a phone conversation with the curator? Figuring with the museum closed, they're all sitting around with their feet up, of course. And she said, oh my God, Ellen, you have no idea what's going on here. She said, it's like trying to put the brakes literally on something like the Titanic. She said, we have paintings that are on their way here from all over the world, and we don't even know where they are. She said, we have exhibits that are coming together, and it takes a long time to pull this off. We borrow paintings from people, they loan them to us. We have to find them. We have to stop things. She said, and we can't find any, everything's closed. So I never did get to talk to her, but it was really eye-opening when you start thinking about, well, just because things shut down, a lot of things aren't shutting down, and you do have to put the brakes, like museums. And it was really, it was very interesting.
It was a challenge.
Obviously
a challenge then.
Yeah.
Well, segues into one of my favorite characters in the book, Marilyn Gilbert Bernard, who's the curator from the museum.
She is the curator, right? Who I never met.
I understand she's based on a real person.
She is. And thank you for asking about that. So what happened was, I had already decided that my curator is going to be this woman, Marilyn Gilbert Bernard. And there's a bookstore here in Virginia called One More Page Books, and they are in Arlington. And they are going to be in the backyard of Amazon 2 or whatever it's called. But their property taxes had been raised unbelievably, because it's a complicated thing with the tax base in Arlington, and they were in a mixed building, and all of a sudden they said, well, you're not going to pay residential taxes, you're going to pay commercial taxes, and their taxes went up just exponentially. So they ended up having a fundraiser. And one of the things that, and a lot of authors stepped up to help, and I volunteered a character name. So there was a woman named Rochelle Zone, and she was best friends with Marilyn Gilbert Bernard, who actually was a former school librarian in the Fairfax County, Virginia library system, and she was dying of cancer. And Rochelle was determined that Marilyn's name, she was going to win this auction, this bid, this item in the auction. And Eileen McGurvey, the owner, said that every time anybody bid, Rochelle came in and like upped the bid by another $100 or something. It was the second most expensive item in the whole auction, except for I think it was lunch with the Washington Capitals publicity team after they won the Stanley Cup. And so there was that. So I called Rochelle and I said, tell me about Marilyn. And she said she was much beloved. A lot of students attribute their love of reading to her. And she just told me all about her personality, and she said, and she had a Venus flytrap. So that's where the Venus flytrap in the book comes from. And she said Marilyn would say to students who were coming into her office, when they had something they had to tell her that they knew she wasn't going to like, she'd look at her plant and she'd go, well, my plant hasn't eaten in 2 weeks, and sort of put the fear of God in everybody who came in. So I really love that. So I gave my Marilyn a Venus flytrap, and Rochelle wrote me afterwards, and she said, you absolutely got Marilyn to a T. She passed away before she found out that she won. Mm-hmm. But so it ended up being sort of more like in memoriam. And I really, it meant a lot to me to get it right, and especially knowing the whole backstory about Marilyn. But so it was. I enjoyed that character too. I liked her a lot.
Very much so. The Venus flytrap is something I don't think an author would actually dare to create, and yet it really existed, and that's why real life always surprises us.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. Yeah.
There was also some other aspects of the book I appreciated. There is the involvement of tetrahydrozoline, which
Oh,
I remember from TV ads, and I think it was like Visine. That was
it
there's such
is.
a one of those things, and apparently it's being used in a certain way, and you actually had to talk to a woman who's known as the Poison Lady about it.
I did. Lucy Zara. Yep. Yep. She helped me.
How did you find her? How does somebody become known as the Poison Lady?
Oh, she gives talks at a lot of the mystery conferences and everything else. She's quite well known,
Ah,
and she helps a lot of us. So you can get in a lot of trouble asking in the wrong places how to poison somebody. You know, I did it once with the CDC, and I really this is many books ago, and I just thought, well, I'll just ask. You know, how would you do this, that, and the other thing? And then they called me back and they said, you know, we checked you out because they wanted to know why you wanted to know how to kill somebody like. So Lucy's great, you know, she gets it. She knows you're doing it, you know, it's fiction and everything else. But I happened to read a newspaper article about an unusual way to commit murder. And you know, you find the best things in newspapers. And I'm a big fan of print newspapers.
yeah.
I'm having written for a couple. So there was an article and I thought, well, that's really interesting. And, you know, I'm not, you know, I'm not a scientist or an expert or something, but that was a pretty sort of, you know, something that anybody knows about are eye drops. And so I did a little more research, and then Lucy helped me out and gave me some more information, not having actually seen somebody murdered that way, but we kind of worked our way through it.
Well, let's hope we never do. Agatha Christie had an instance of that, and it was a murder method from one of her books, and a reader read that and realized the symptoms matched someone she knew who was slowly dying of the same, and it turned out to be she was being poisoned by, I can't remember, her husband or boyfriend.
Right.
And so that you have to be careful always about
You do.
revealing too much.
I know. I did a book on anthrax, and a professor from the University of Virginia, when I was down in Charlottesville doing a signing, came to one of my events, and he was a microbiologist. And I said, can I write you? And he said, okay. And then I wrote him all the stuff about anthrax and everything else. And he finally wrote me back and said, I'm sorry for the delay, but he said, I'm so worried about somebody, like, you know, reading my university email and wondering why I'm trying to tell you about anthrax. And I mean, it is a, you know, it's a thing. You have to really be careful. I mean, you don't know who you're talking to and what information you're
Was this
passing.
after the outbreak of poisonings? Oh yes, absolutely.
That's why I thought about it.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing was the limitations of extradition, which I have never heard of, that, you know, states will not go beyond adjacent states to take back certain classes of criminals or suspects.
Right.
And you, according to your notes, you credit a detective, Jim Smith. Was he somebody you just called up on the phone and say,
no, Jim and I met ages ago over a barking dog. It's a really long story. But we just got to be friends, and then I used now he's on nights, but when he was on days, I would take him out for lunch and pick his brain, and which he loved it. I mean, he really loved it. And but I mean, we'd be sitting like in a restaurant and we'd be talking about something, and Jim was just you know, he's great. I mean, you meet somebody who really gets it. They know what you're trying to do. And it's like, well, how could you do that? And then he'll think about it and come back with a way to, you know, well, you would do this. You wouldn't think about that. But then you say, well, then, you know, you open the car door and then her head fell off. And the people around you are suddenly just backing away, you know, and I said, okay. But he was very, you know, and then he'd send me pictures, you know, of people who've been strangled and, you know, and all kinds of stuff. So I had some very interesting email, but he's a very dear friend. And I was really stuck for the ending with this book. And we talked about it, and I said, well, I don't know what to do. And he's the one who said, well, it's extradition. We just haven't got the resources. We would never bother to get some low life, you know, person in I don't know, Minnesota or whatever. We're just not going to go there. So they just get away from us. And in this case, it was New York and Washington. And he just said, we haven't got the money. We can't do it. And I thought, that's brilliant. So the extradition made it into the book.
Yeah. Sometimes you just have to write and hope something happens.
I often do that.
So how much planning do you do with your plots? How far do you go before you decide to start writing?
I read and do a lot of research, and I get ideas. And then, do you know mind mapping? Have you ever seen mind mapping?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mind map now. I really, my oldest son was talking to me about this, and he's an analyst in military, and he's a civilian analyst in the military. He's with Africa Command now, but they do a lot of, sort of creative, well, what if kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. And I do that a lot. And I find that when I have a piece of paper and I just start, putting down things that are going to be important, and then I start trying to connect them, that works really well for me. So I do that. Back in the day, this is the only first book I've written where I haven't gone anywhere or done anything. I always go to the library. We have a great library system in Fairfax County, Virginia, and I go there, and you find older books that you're not going to find in the bookstore. That just ended up on just a very interesting collection of books on the or in the catalog that you can have ordered from the other libraries. So I do that, and I slowly start to kind of chunk out my book, and I took a course in London years ago by Robert McKee on story structure.
Oh, yes.
And he talked about writing in scenes for movies. Yeah. And so ever since then, I write in scenes, and it's very unsexy, but I just use I use numbers now. I used to use Excel, but I just put every scene is written in a line on a spreadsheet. And if I at the end of my writing session, if it doesn't match where the story's going, I go back and change the spreadsheet to match where I'm going. But I need to make sure that it'll all fit together at the end of the year when I have to turn the book in. Mm-hmm. And so I'm pretty linear. I have, friends who can write a chunk here and a chunk there. I have a lot of friends who are, pantsers, as we call them, seat of the pants. I interviewed Cara Black, who wrote 3 Hours in Paris, the book on the attempt to assassinate Hitler. Yeah. And it's got a timeline in it. And I interviewed her for the Virginia Book Festival. And I said, well, I read somewhere that you're a pantser. And she goes, yeah. And I said, how can you write a detailed book like that by the seat of your pants? And she did. So I plan. Mm-hmm. It's just my way.
I like planning and plotting and connecting,
It doesn't you lose the spontaneity. And I think that's the big thing that people think. It's like, well, then and it's like, yeah, but you also get more possibilities. And I do multiple drafts. And as I go back, it's like, I could do that and I could do that. And I'll get more into my book, and then I'll think, and then I'll call the people I want to talk to. And I usually try to get somebody who's at a pretty high level. And by that time, I'm asking hopefully the nuanced questions. I want their language. I want their expressions. I want to hear, sort of the things that I didn't get out of the book or from Dr. Google or, whatever, mm-hmm. all that sort of thing. So it's kind of a whole process for me, I think.
Yeah. And also you're not wasting their time. You're actually having specific questions that you want to do. Yep. So I could see that.
Yeah. Yes.
Well, I'll have one more question. Okay. What do we see in Lucy's future? What can you tell us? You're working on the next book, I understand.
Right. Which should be done tomorrow. It actually should have been done May 1st, but I got an extension. They've sort of been slowly moving toward Lucy and Corinne are going to get married. But me being me, the whole notion of climate change is getting to be a bigger and bigger deal in the Virginia wine industry. And so I've been very lucky in the past couple of years to come back into contact with probably one of the top vineyard consultants in the country, a woman named Lucy Morton, who her mother actually always believed that I named Lucy Montgomery for her daughter, because I'd read a book that she wrote on wine and growing in the Eastern United States when I started the series. But Lucy's she's been talking to me a lot. And I am really, just as a person, I'm really concerned about what's happening, to, the whole notion of climate change and what it's doing. Yeah. And it's so easy to see the immediacy of the impact in the wine industry, and what I'm hearing from all the winemakers I talk to. I mean, it's a really, and Lucy said to me, Lucy Morton, she said, it's extreme climate, there's climate change, but there are these extremes, and there are these just crazy fluctuations. There'll be years when Virginia has so much wine. A couple of years ago, nobody picked any grapes. They either rotted or they didn't ripen, mm-hmm. and they couldn't get picked because of all the rain. So it's a bigger and bigger deal. Mm-hmm. So that's that's the second book and the next book is actually called Bitter Roots.
Oh, okay. Well, we'll be looking forward to that. Ellen, thank you so much for talking with us today. I know it's the afternoon, so I can only raise my glass and
Oh, thank you. I've got my water.
and your water bottle. But thank you so much. This is Bill Peschel for the Mechanicsburg Mystery Bookshop with a conversation with Ellen Crosby. And I hope that your favorite book is your next book. Thank you very much for showing up. Bye-bye. The Mechanicsburg Mystery Presents podcast is sponsored by the Mechanicsburg Mystery Bookshop in Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania. The store is open with limited hours, plus we accept appointments and offer a drive-by service. The store will also ship books to your home, including those from the Peschel Press Mystery line, including our annotated editions of novels by Agatha Christie and Dorothy L. Sayers. To learn more, visit the store at www.mysterybooksonline.com. And thank you for listening.